The invitation to host Thanksgiving dinner had been Mom's idea, though she'd presented it as doing me a favor. "Since you're so proud of your little apartment," she'd said over the phone, "maybe it's time the family saw how you're really living." I should have recognized the trap. In 28 years, my parents had never expressed genuine interest in visiting my home. But I was feeling optimistic about finally having something to show them. A beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in Harbor Heights, one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors, granite countertops, and a view of the harbor that real estate agents called million-dollar worthy. What they didn't know was that I'd been working in property management and real estate investment for the past 4 years, building a portfolio that started with small residential properties and had grown into something substantial. The Harbor Heights apartment wasn't just where I lived. It was part of a larger strategy that they'd never bothered to ask about. Growing up, I was always the family disappointment. My older sister Rebecca was the doctor, my younger brother Kyle was the engineer, and I was the one who never found my direction. When I dropped out of law school to work in real estate, Dad had been devastated. "Real estate," he'd said with the same tone he might use for sewage management. "That's not a career, it's what people do when they can't do anything else." For years, every family gathering included subtle digs about my unstable income and lack of real profession. They assumed I was barely scraping by, working as some kind of rental agent or property showing assistant. I'd stopped trying to explain what I actually did, acquisitions, portfolio management, investment analysis, because their eyes would glaze over. They'd already decided I was the failure, and contradictory evidence just bounced off. But Harbor Heights was different. This was a neighborhood where successful people lived. Doctors, lawyers, executives, entrepreneurs. The kind of people my parents respected. I thought maybe, finally, seeing where I lived would shift their perception of my success. I spent 2 days preparing for Thanksgiving dinner. I bought the expensive organic turkey, the imported wine, the artisanal desserts from the bakery they always mentioned loving. I cleaned my apartment until it sparkled, arranged fresh flowers, and set the table with the good china I'd been collecting. They arrived an hour late, which was typical. Dad immediately started examining everything with the suspicious air of someone looking for evidence of fraud. Mom wandered around touching surfaces like she was checking for dust. Rebecca and Kyle seemed impressed despite themselves, though they tried to hide it. "Nice place," Kyle admitted, looking out at the harbor view. "Must cost a fortune to rent." "Actually, probably splitting it with roommates," Dad interrupted, not looking up from where he was examining my sound system. "Only way someone in your situation could afford this area." I started to correct him, but Mom cut me off. "Where should we put our coats?" "Somewhere that won't be in the way when your roommates come home." "I don't have roommates. I live here alone." Dad snorted. "Sure you do. What are you paying $3,000 a month for? That's more than some people's mortgage payments." "I'm not paying rent actually. Subletting then," Rebecca said with authority. "That makes sense. Probably found someone who needed a temporary arrangement." I gave up trying to explain and focused on getting dinner ready. Let them think whatever they wanted. The meal would speak for itself and maybe they'd finally see that I was doing well. But as dinner progressed, their comments got sharper. Dad criticized the wine selection, trying too hard. Mom questioned whether the turkey was really organic or just expensive, and Rebecca made pointed observations about people who live beyond their means. The breaking point came during dessert. I'd bought a beautiful tart from Delacroix Patisserie, the same bakery where Mom always bragged about getting Rebecca's wedding cake. Cost $80, but I wanted everything to be perfect. "This is good," Kyle said, taking a second bite. "Where'd you get it?" "Delacroix Patisserie," I said, hoping Mom would recognize the name. She did. "That place is incredibly expensive. How much did you spend on this dinner?" $1,000. $1,500. I wanted to make it special. "With what money?" Dad's voice got sharp. "You're living in an apartment that probably costs more than I make in a month, buying groceries that cost more than most people's car payments, and you expect us to believe you can afford this?" "I can afford it. My business is doing well." "What business?" Rebecca laughed. "You work for a real estate company. You're an employee, not a business owner." I tried to explain about property investment, about building equity through strategic acquisitions, about how real estate could generate passive income. But Dad was already shaking his head. Real estate investment, he said the words like they tasted bad. You mean flipping houses? Scamming desperate sellers? That's not investing, that's gambling. It's not flipping houses. I buy rental properties and... With what money? Mom demanded. You didn't have any money when you dropped out of law school. You didn't inherit anything. So where did you get the capital for these supposed investments? I could have shown them my portfolio spreadsheets, my bank statements, my property deeds. But something in their tone told me it wouldn't matter. They'd already decided this was all some kind of elaborate scam or delusion. Maybe we should talk about something else, Kyle suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But Dad wasn't done. He stood up and walked to the window looking out at the harbor view. You know what I think? I think you're in debt up to your eyeballs. I think you're renting this place month to month with credit cards, buying expensive food with credit cards, and playing dress up in a neighborhood you can't afford. Dad, that's not. Don't lie to me. His voice got louder. I've seen this before. People who can't handle money getting in over their heads, pretending to be successful until the whole thing comes crashing down. You're headed for bankruptcy and you're too proud to admit it. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom was nodding along with everything Dad said. Rebecca looked embarrassed but not contradictory. Kyle was studying his dessert plate like it held the secrets of the universe. I sat there for a moment processing what had just happened. They'd come to my home, eaten my food, enjoyed my hospitality, and concluded that it was all evidence of my moral and financial failure. I'm not in debt, I said quietly. Then prove it, Dad challenged. Show me your bank statements. Show me your income documentation. Show me how someone with your job history can afford to live like this. Before I could respond, he was walking around my living room again, but this time with the demeanor of a detective gathering evidence. He picked up mail from my side table and started reading return addresses. Harbor Heights Property Management, he read aloud. Probably your landlord sending eviction notices. Dad, please don't. Metropolitan Investment Group. Debt collectors, I bet. He was getting worked up now, his voice rising with each piece of mail. City of Harbor Heights Tax Assessment Office. Probably threatening liens on property you pretend to own. Mom joined in, examining my bookshelf. Look at all these real estate books. Property investment strategies, building rental income, real estate portfolio management. She's been reading get-rich-quick schemes. Those aren't get-rich-quick books. They're fantasy, Rebecca said with the certainty that comes from a medical degree. People who actually have money don't need to read books about how to get money. Dad had moved to the kitchen and was opening my cabinets, like he expected to find evidence of my deception hidden behind the cereal boxes. Everything here is too expensive for someone in your situation. The cookware, the appliances, even the coffee maker. You're living a lifestyle that doesn't match your income level. Maybe that's because you don't know what my income level actually is. I know exactly what real estate agents make, he said dismissively. And it's not enough for this. I'm not a real estate agent. I'm a property acquisition specialist and portfolio manager. He waved his hand like he was brushing away a fly. Fancy titles don't change reality. You're living beyond your means in a neighborhood where you don't belong, and sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because of how confidently he said them. How certain he was that I was failing, despite all evidence to the contrary. You're too broke for this neighborhood, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of my apartment. Stop pretending you belong here with successful people. You're embarrassing yourself and embarrassing this family. Mom nodded emphatically. We didn't raise you to live a lie. Find an apartment you can actually afford and stop this charade before you ruin your credit permanently. I kept eating my dessert quietly, letting their words wash over me. Part of me wanted to pull out my laptop and show them my property management software, my investment portfolio, my monthly revenue reports. But a bigger part of me realized it wouldn't matter. They'd find a way to dismiss or minimize anything I showed them. Are you even listening to us? Rebecca asked. This is serious. You could lose everything. I looked up at her. I'm listening. Then why aren't you responding? Why aren't you defending yourself? Because you've already made up your minds. Dad returned to the table, his face flushed with frustration. We're trying to help you. We're trying to save you from making a mistake that could ruin your life. But you have to be honest with us about your situation. My situation is that I'm a successful property investor who owns multiple rental properties and lives comfortably within my means. That's delusional, Mom said flatly. People like you don't become successful property investors. That takes money, connections, experience, things you don't have. People like me? She gestured vaguely. People who couldn't finish law school. People who've never held a stable job. People who don't understand how money works. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Everyone turned to look toward the entrance. Expecting someone? Pal asked. I wasn't, but I was grateful for the interruption. I'll see who it is. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A middle-aged man in a business suit stood in the hallway, holding a folder and checking his watch. I didn't recognize him, but his professional appearance suggested he wasn't a random visitor. I opened the door. Can I help you, Miss Chin? I'm Robert Martinez from Harbor Heights Property Management. I apologize for stopping by during the holiday, but we had a maintenance emergency in Building C that requires your approval for the repair costs. The contractor needs authorization tonight to start work tomorrow morning. I could hear my family's conversation stop completely behind me. The silence was so absolute that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Of course, I said. What's the situation? Burst pipe in Unit 12C flooded 3 apartments. The water damage is extensive, and we need approval for emergency repairs plus temporary relocation costs for the affected tenants. The estimate is about $40,000 for repairs and another $15,000 for temporary housing. He handed me the folder. As I opened it and reviewed the documentation, I could feel my family's stares boring into my back. This looks reasonable, I said, signing the authorization forms. How long before the tenants can move back in? About 2 weeks if we start tomorrow. I'll coordinate with the insurance adjuster and keep you updated on the progress. Perfect. And Robert? Make sure the affected tenants know we'll cover any additional expenses they incur during the displacement. Hotel meals, laundry, transportation, whatever they need. Will do. Thank you for the quick response, Ms. Chin. Happy Thanksgiving. I closed the door and turned around to face my family. 4 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. Who was that? Dad asked, his voice much quieter than it had been moments before. The property manager for Harbor Heights. Property manager for what? For the building. And the 3 adjacent buildings. The silence stretched out for what felt like minutes. Rebecca was the first to speak. You mean, you manage those buildings? I own them. More silence. Dad sat down heavily in his chair, still holding a piece of mail from my side table. You own this building, Mom said slowly, like she was testing the words. And the one next to it. And the 2 across the street. Kyle leaned forward. When you said you weren't paying rent. I meant I'm not paying rent. It's hard to pay rent to yourself. Dad looked down at the mail in his hand, the envelope from Harbor Heights Property Management that he'd assumed was an eviction notice. What's this then? Monthly revenue reports. Occupancy rates, maintenance schedules, profit and loss statements. He opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper. His eyes moved across the numbers, and I watched his expression change from skepticism to disbelief to something approaching shock. This says monthly rental income of. He stopped and looked up at me. This can't be right. $43,000 in November. It was a good month. We had high occupancy and minimal maintenance costs. Rebecca grabbed the papers from Dad's hands and started reading. Net profit after expenses, $28,000. For 1 month? Like I said, it was a good month. Mom was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien. How long have you owned these buildings? I bought the first one 3 years ago. The others I acquired over the past 18 months as they came on the market. With what money? Dad's question came out as barely a whisper. I started with a small down payment on a duplex in the University District. Lived in one unit, rented out the other. Used the rental income and my salary to save for the next property. Repeated the process, gradually moving up to larger properties with better cash flow potential. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out a folder I kept there. These are the property deeds. Harbor Heights buildings A through D. All owned free and clear as of 6 months ago. Kyle took the folder and started flipping through the documents. Free and clear? You mean no mortgages? The cash flow from the first 3 buildings generated enough income to buy the 4th building outright. Debt-free ownership was always the goal. Dad was still staring at the revenue reports. You make more in a month than I make in a year. Some months are better than others. But yes, the business has been successful. The room fell quiet again. I could see them all processing this information, trying to reconcile their assumptions about my failure with the evidence in front of them. Rebecca was the first to recover. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling? I tried to tell you. Multiple times. But every time I mentioned property investment or real estate business, you dismissed it as gambling or get-rich-quick schemes. But you could have shown us documentation, Mom protested. You could have proved you were successful. When would have been a good time to prove myself to people who had already decided I was a failure? At Christmas dinner when you lectured me about finding a real job? At Rebecca's birthday when you introduced me to her friends as the one who couldn't finish law school? At Kyle's graduation when you told people I was still figuring things out? They exchanged glances and I could see the uncomfortable recognition in their faces. They remembered those conversations differently than I did, but they couldn't deny the pattern. Dad set down the revenue reports and looked around my apartment with new eyes. So all of this is paid for with income from my real estate portfolio. The furniture, the art, the kitchen appliances, all purchased with money I earned from properties I own. And dinner tonight? Was expensive because I wanted to celebrate Thanksgiving with my family. I can afford expensive dinners now. Kyle was still reading through the property deeds. These buildings are worth millions. About 12 million in total according to the most recent appraisals. Mom sat down like her legs had given out. $12 million. The business is worth more than the buildings themselves. The rental income, the long-term leases, the property management contracts. It's a complete real estate operation. Rebecca shook her head slowly. And we just spent 2 hours telling you that you're living beyond your means. And that I'm embarrassing the family by pretending to belong in this neighborhood. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This was the silence of people realizing they'd made a fundamental error, not just in facts but in judgment. I think, Dad said finally, I owe you an apology. You owe me more than that. He looked up, surprised by the sharpness in my voice. You owe me an explanation. You owe me an explanation for why you assumed the worst about me for years. Why you never asked detailed questions about my work. Why you dismissed every attempt I made to explain my business. Why you decided I was a failure and then interpreted everything I did through that lens. Mom started to say something but I held up my hand. I dropped out of law school because I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. But instead of asking me what I did want to do, you decided it meant I was directionless. I started working in real estate and instead of asking me to explain the industry, you assumed it was a dead-end job. I bought my first property and instead of congratulating me, you warned me about getting in over my head. Rebecca cleared her throat. We didn't understand. You didn't want to understand. Understanding would have required admitting that maybe I knew something you didn't. Maybe the family disappointment had actually found something she was good at. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor view, the same view Dad had been admiring earlier while telling me I couldn't afford to live here. Do you know what the hardest part has been? Not building the business. That was just work. The hardest part has been succeeding while my own family was rooting for me to fail. Do you know how isolating it is to achieve something you're proud of and have nowhere to share that pride? Kyle set down the property deeds. We weren't rooting for you to fail. Weren't you? Every family gathering, you all seemed disappointed that I wasn't struggling more. Like my success was somehow inconvenient for the narrative you'd created about me. Dad was staring at his hands. We were worried about you. We thought you were making poor decisions. Based on what evidence? Based on actually looking at my financial situation? Based on asking detailed questions about my business model? Or based on the assumption that because I didn't follow your prescribed path, I must be failing? The questions hung in the air unanswered. Because the truth was they'd never looked for evidence. They'd made their assumptions and stuck with them, filtering everything through their preconceptions. Mom wiped her eyes and I realized she was crying. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. I know you are. But sorry doesn't undo 4 years of being treated like the family charity case. Sorry doesn't give me back the family support I needed when I was building this business. Sorry doesn't erase the constant stress of knowing that my own parents thought I was a failure. Robert Martinez knocked again and I went to answer it. He handed me another set of documents. Emergency repair approval for Building D, he explained. HVAC system failure. We need to replace the entire unit before tomorrow or the tenants will be without heat over the weekend. I reviewed and signed the authorization for another $15,000 in repairs. After he left, I turned back to my family. That's how my business works, I said. Problems come up, decisions need to be made quickly and tenants depend on me to solve them. It's not gambling or get-rich-quick schemes. It's real business with real responsibilities. Dad stood up and walked over to me. Can you forgive us? I looked at him for a long moment. I can forgive you, but I can't forget how this felt. And I can't pretend that everything goes back to normal now that you know I'm successful. What does that mean? It means that maybe we need to rebuild our relationship from scratch. Maybe you need to get to know who I actually am instead of who you assumed I was. Rebecca joined us by the window. We'd like that. We'd like to know who you really are. I smiled for the first time all evening. I'm someone who owns 4 apartment buildings and makes more money in a month than most people make in a year. I'm someone who employs 12 people and provides housing for over 200 families. I'm someone who built a business from nothing and now has enough financial security to afford $80 desserts without thinking twice. And, Kyle added, reading from one of my business cards he'd found on the side table, you're the CEO of Harbor Heights Property Group. I'm also someone who invited her family for Thanksgiving dinner because she wanted to share her success with the people she loves. Even when those people spent the evening telling her she was living beyond her means. We stood there looking out at the harbor as the sun set over the water. The view really was worth millions, I should know since I'd had it appraised. Can we start over? Mom asked quietly. We can try. Dad picked up one of the property deeds again. Would you be willing to tell us about your business? Really tell us, I mean. Help us understand how it works. I'd like that. And for the first time in years I meant it. The validation felt good, but what felt better was the possibility that maybe, finally, my family might see me for who I really was instead of who they'd decided I should be. Later that evening, after they'd left, I stood in my apartment. My apartment that I owned, in my building that I owned, in my neighborhood where I definitely belonged, and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time with my family. I felt proud.